Welcome to Rising Woman Leaders. I'm your host, Meredith Ram, and I believe the time has come for women to share their gifts, their voice, and their stories. I love seeing women spiritually and financially empowered, thriving in their life's work, and doing what they love every day. I've gathered a community of women living their dreams to tell us their stories and inspire us to step into more courage, self-love, and feminine leadership. If you like this podcast, follow me on Instagram at Rising Woman Leaders and sign up for email updates at risingwomanleaders.com. Now get cozy with a journal and a cup of tea. I hope you enjoy today's show. I'm here today with Baelyn Elspeth, and Baelyn travels and devotes her time to sharing and facilitating sacred spaces for communities all around the world, bringing the medicine of tea and song wherever she goes. She primarily focuses on collaborative efforts, and so alongside the offerings of other sisters, she holds retreats, workshops, and is a council member of the annual Women's Gathering Spirit Weavers. She also nurtures and curates a permanent home for tea and ceremony at I Am in Playa del Rey, California. Thanks for being here, Baelyn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
it's a pleasure.
Yeah, I was curious just your intention around the offerings that you create, being in collaboration. And I was just reading that before we got on this call, and I just wanted to ask you about that, your decision to really choose to focus your work in collaboration. What was that decision like for you, and what has collaboration just been like for you in your life and your work?
That just actually came up this morning. So, for example, just recently, last weekend completed one of our elemental warrior priestess training immersions, and my teaching partner, Bree Fisher, at this point, it's become more and more specific who and how I collaborate with. But I do really feel that collaboration in teaching spaces is when you are aligned with the work that someone else is offering, and the offerings are aligned with one another and they complement one another. Collaboration and collaborative efforts are very expanding, and they also really help one listen more to how to harmonize a space with someone else. And for me, I find that especially where we are now, it's a very important tool to cultivate, because it's not just, it's kind of stepping outside of this me, my, I ego, and opening myself up to a listening to what is happening in a dance and a shared exchange between myself and the external universe. And that could be in the form of someone that I'm collaborating with. So it actually does show me a lot about my capacity, my limitations, my capabilities, and where I'm really good at something, and also where I need to work harder. And also continues to streamline and sort of distill that which I'm aligned with, like what my work is and who I like to do work to, who I like to work with, in a sense. So Bree, she is a practitioner and a teacher of Qigong and sword form, and I'm a practitioner of the sacred arts of tea and ceremony and tea through meditation. And so those lineages have been completely unified for thousands of years in the Asian arts. And so it's so cohesive to be in the space with her and to have a balancing. It's almost like the yin and the yang of how we get to hold space and teach together. So it's really fun to play with those polarities, and when to be yin and when to be yang, and when to merge with another human, and how we're flowing in one stream, and then also how we're holding our individuality. So it's extremely informational and helps orient towards growth,
Yeah, I agree.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And it's so much the feminine is so much about collaboration. And I know I've done a lot on my own, but I've also done some collaborations, and the energy exchange of just the joy that comes, like getting to work with another person, and also, the sharing and the edges and all of it. It's just like, okay, here is that opportunity for growth. So yeah, I found it to be really a beautiful exchange as well. And also you get to share some of the work. It's like, you don't have to, I think in our culture, there's been a lot of like, I can do it on my own, or I'm not going to ask for help. And to be able to like share in that is so much more spacious. Yeah.
Yeah. And it can be challenging to share that space, right? It'll show you like how much you want to hold on to things and control every little thing. It'll also show you how fluid, like if you have the capability to be adaptable and fluid. And it also helps to clarify, like my own personal authenticity and truth of how I show up and what I'm able to provide, and really, really engage in direct and clear communication so that everyone understands their roles very clearly. And I understand my role very clearly. And so it has that kind of clarifying effect while also doing what you're saying, which is like stepping into the space of the feminine and this communal effort. And, we don't exist by ourselves in time and space. We are in individual experiences, but my whole being is dependent on the external world around me. So the more that I get to take an opportunity to engage in that as a truth in practice, I feel like it expands my awareness of how that truth meets me in the external world constantly, that I'm a part of everything. I'm not just this sole person alone doing it. Even the way that my body functions, it's not functioning on its own by itself. There's like 90% microbiomes and microbes and bacteria floating around inside doing their job. And I depend on those things to help me to be alive. So, it's like we're always constantly in a collaborative effort. So allowing that to be the truth of our experience and practice it more and more lends to, for me, like a more skillful way of being able to approach daily life and how I'm able to work with others and the world around me in general.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a movie a friend's film I was just watching yesterday, which is about water and climate change and our ecosystems. And it's like, we all need each other and we need to be working together. And there was just some shots about farming and like the soil and how even cattle and grazing and how all the animals like work with the earth and like to return the soil and just different things that are needed in an ecosystem. It's like when we separate that, and the water was actually, the movie was particularly about the LA area and how we've kind of more boxed ourselves into the pavement and the houses, and like we get our food from having to transport it in, and rather than having these like communities where we're growing the food and working in that ecosystem more naturally. So I'm curious, like for you growing up, was mindfulness or meditation or the ways of the feminine, was that part of your upbringing, or was that something that came later?
It was not part of my household. I grew up in kind of East LA proper, East Los Angeles. And, I don't want to kind of sing a story about kind of like a challenged environment, but I grew up as a minority in my environment where I grew up in a predominantly Hispanic and Latin community, and studied, my grandma put me in dance to kind of keep me busy and off the streets, because, the neighborhoods and things that were going on socially around me were things that were, potentially categorized as destructive or not such positive experiences for a healthy youth upbringing. So I was kept busy by she put me in dance classes. So I was taking ballet and folklorico, and I was really immersed in that, going to school and being kept busy by these disciplinary acts through the movement, through the form of dance. And so that kind of helped shape and curate and focus me in a particular type of way, where it just created discipline of the body, in a sense, of how I engage with my physical experience. So I would say that all of the, and because of the environment that I grew up in, I actually did wear an intense kind of layer of protection around me energetically, and very much so operated in the world until I was in my kind of mid-20s in this very much more masculine kind of way, and was always having to kind of like prove myself and, protect myself. And even just the way I would dress, like I was always I never really wore dresses until I was like in my mid-20s, and I was not soft at all. I was actually quite challenging sometimes and difficult to just hard-headed and quick to verbally argue and disagree and prove my point and fight in different kinds of ways. So, as one starts to engage in practices surrounding understanding the levels and layers of identity that we have put on from a young age to survive, and starting to understand that I don't need those for survival anymore. So now I have to start taking off the masks that I put on and de-identifying, disidentifying with this story, so that I can start to actually tap into the truth of my internal being, that eternal being. So that took a lot of time and self-observation. It's like, why do I feel the need to do that, to protect myself in the first place, right? And the layers have sloughed off, and there's a lot more openness, but there's still ways in which it still happens, right? So it's just constant work and engaging and being awake to present moment experience and how we identify our present moment experience with where we come from, and the ways in which we start to, be able to engage in a more present experience with what's happening now, not based on our wounds and our traumas and our survival mechanisms and our coping mechanisms. If that makes sense. So.
Yeah. And I recognize that some of the practices that are part of your life, like the tea ceremony, maybe qigong or silent meditation, they have an essence of discipline, like an essence of really showing up in that. And I'm curious about how discipline has served you, and also how you've navigated like letting that go too, and like the feminine essence of just being free flowing, and like that dance between the two.
Yeah, that's a really good, it's a really good contemplation and place to reflect. I actually would say that if we put discipline into the category of like the yang or the masculine expression, and we put letting go or surrender or the more kind of like wild, untethered self into the feminine expression, I find that the more that my feminine expression trusts in the pathway of my masculine, like the part of me that has discipline and direction, like the more that I know that I commit to that discipline and direction for myself, and that is an anchor point inside of me of stillness that I can always return to, I actually feel safer to completely extend myself to the other side of the spectrum and completely rip it all off and be in my most wild, expressive self. And that space of like, I feel safe to do that because I know that if I get to an edge that all of a sudden feels unsafe, I know where to sit in my seat of quietness and stillness and centeredness to remember that place of quietude. And because I've cultivated that as a discipline in my life, it's a trustworthy experience that I'm able to sit within. So, and I think this happens internally or within the way that our, right and left side merges, our yin and our yang. I like to use those terms a little bit more sometimes because we have a lot of association at this point with identification with masculine, feminine, man, woman, God, goddess, all of these kinds of ways of polarizing. And really just, it's this expression of the earth and the heavens. And so the more that we trust in the place that we're anchoring to, and we send up that golden rod of clarity in the spine and in the central consciousness, the more that I'm able to just sink into the earth and go completely raw and trust in my earthy experience. And so those two spectrums are actually very important for me. And I like to play heavily in both of them. Mm-hmm. I love to be in the refinement, and I also love to just completely be like a wild savage beast in a sense, and those, and I like knowing that I have access to those spaces. It gives me a wider spectrum of play in between as well.
Yeah.
That makes sense too.
Yeah. I love that concept of fully expressing one actually gives us permission to fully express the other and the sense of safety. And I find that too with when there's some structure, it's almost like my more yin side can just fully rest into that. Sometimes with my clients, I'm helping them work with their schedule, and it's they have some goals and dreams that they're working towards. And so setting some structures up in that way, it's it's in service to maybe their more feminine dreams and desires and heart longings. And if we totally get rid of the structure, it's totally boundless, and it doesn't have that same kind of direction. So it can be in service too. And even with the schedule, it's okay, let's put your self-care in first, which I do think of often that more yin, creating space for it, making sure that it is a part of our lives.
Yeah. And we can also relate it to, the other words that I really love to use are the form and the formless, right? And, to achieve freedom, true freedom, we actually have to engage fully in the form and find that liberation through the form, because we are in these bodies and we are in this human experience that we have. So if we can actually cultivate and curate that experience through form, there's a doorway in that once we show up in the discipline, when you are able to be disciplined enough to let it all go and just fly, that's truer liberation than just not really having any structure and just being kind of all over the place and wild. Do you know what I mean? Wild without any kind of direction. Yeah. So feeling the space in between those two is it's where kind of a lot of magic happens. Yeah. Finding freedom through form. Yes. And it's I like to use, because I danced for so many years, the dance is such a beautiful expression of that. Where if you're so in tune with your body and you just know, or even ballet I studied ballet for a long time. So ballet is a really beautiful expression of that, in the sense that when a ballerina has to go through much discipline and sacrifice and hardship to discipline her body to move in the ways that it needs to move for this method of dance. But when she's a skilled dancer and she gets on the stage and she spent, every day lifting her leg in the same spot over and over, and and really disciplined herself in those movements, then she gets on stage to dance and she just lets go, and a good dancer will just be in the spirit of the dance, and then all of that form kicks into play because her body knows what to do, but then her spirit just expands and she turns into a bird and she flies across the stage, and the audience is like, and it's like this expression of freedom, and it looks so graceful and easy, but it's taken so much practice and sacrifice for her to get to that point. So it's a nice analogy for it as well.
Yeah, I love picturing that. Do you have a morning practice right now, like a daily practice? I'm wondering if you would share what that looks like for you.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm at the moment, my fate is that I travel quite a bit. So, depending on circumstantially, like where I find myself, but I try to maintain a pretty consistent regimen of being like, I wake up the way that I like to wake up. And this has been cultivated over time of just really being in tune with my body is, when I kind of start to stir and open my eyes, I take a lot of time when I'm still laying horizontal to kind of allow my body to intuitively start to move and all my joints to kind of wake up. And so I will start by just kind of moving my fingers and my palms and my hands and circling my wrists and start to stretch my body, like, toes out, arms to, the opposite side of my head. And then, hugging my knees to my chest and just really going into this like really intuitive routine with allowing my body to wake up and be acknowledging of all of its little, aches and pains of just, those ways in which we get stiff from sleeping. I also find that when I sleep on the floor quite a bit, I always feel better. It took me a while to adjust to that, but floor sleeping for me has become part of my sort of routine that I appreciate because it actually is more healthy for my body. I wake up less sore, and because I do these practices every morning, I'm able to track that experience. So I see how quickly my body is able to be agile and wake up as when I'm sleeping on the floor than when I'm like in a bed. If I'm traveling somewhere and I just happen to be like sleeping in a bed for a week, it's so much more achy and harder to kind of kick into action. So I do that. I usually sit up, I meditate for about 20 minutes. And then I get up and put a kettle on and sit for tea and in quiet. And sometimes people are with me, and most of the time people are with me, and sometimes I'm alone. But every morning it's like this, no matter where I am. And then depending on what the day's like, if I have time for extended practice, then I usually move into some qigong, or sometimes I put that later in the day, if depending on kind of where I am. But that'll usually be like that. Like I stretch, meditate, sit for tea, and do some qigong. So kind of like my morning routine.
Yeah. And how did tea find you? How did tea come into
I like that. I like that. I like the way you phrase the question, because most of the time people ask, how did you find tea? But I'm always like, no, tea found me. So it's appropriate to ask it in that way, because I wasn't searching for tea specifically. But she definitely found me. And it's kind of such a journey of a story, and who knows kind of where it starts in a sense. But at one point I was really, I had just come out of doing a yoga teacher training, and I was reading autobiography of a yogi, and I was really inspired by just the story of the journey of being with a teacher and finding a teacher, and a teacher finding a student, or the the teacher presenting itself when the student is ready. And I was like just sitting with that and really kind of consciously and unconsciously praying for a teacher, that I could really understand the reflection of what it meant to be a student, and in a way that was working, like a working relationship, which is kind of harder to find, I would say, these days in where we are. So I had sat with that, and then all of a sudden, there's the story, like I have these two beautiful friends, Colin and Taylor, and at the time they were partners, and they went traveling to Asia and ended up coming across Wuda, who's my teacher, through a series of all kinds of serendipitous events. It's a really beautiful, long story, actually, but I'll just distill it down. And they were really inspired. They ended up staying with him at his center in Taiwan for about 2 months and traveling around China with him a bit. And when they came back to the States, they brought the practice back with them. They were really inspired by the way he was working with tea and using tea as a cultivative practice for a more skillful day-to-day life and the meditative mind. So they were serving tea at their house, and Colin, who now owns this beautiful company called Living Tea, he was really wanting to import tea more and start this company, but he also has such a predilection towards his spiritual practices. So he wanted to share this teacher with us and this community that was around him. So he hosted him to come to Los Angeles. And the first night that he arrived in Los Angeles, I showed up and sat in a tea ceremony with him. And it was like I found two teachers in that moment, whether I knew it or not. But I think I knew immediately one of my teachers, which was tea itself. And then eventually, this, human who's channeling these practices and who has really dedicated his life towards this dharma, this pathway, which is a really inspiring thing to be around at this point in time, because we live in a time and space where there's a lot of tourism of things, and to really go deep and to really dedicate oneself to a pathway is so much rarer to find in time and space now in our modern day and age. So I was really inspired by that level of commitment. And I just started sitting with tea and ended up joining a workshop that weekend, and just really love tea so much. Like every morning I just wake up and go, God, I just want to go hang out with my tea bowl and these tea leaves that I got. And I just started drinking tea every single morning by myself and just sitting and listening and being quiet. And I cried a lot when I first started drinking tea. It just was like unwinding my heart and softening me and cleansing me. And it was just so like giving and nurturing and sweet and loving and also strong. And it just surprised me at every turn and every corner. And so I just, I really felt so taken aback by this plant and tree and medicine. So I just kept going. And, as I kept showing up for it, it started to ask more responsibilities of me. And I've just continued to say yes and step through those doorways in a really integral way and continue working with it and working with Wuda, my teacher, and just dedicating time and space to it as a sacred art.
What are some of the most prevalent or important kind of lessons that you've learned from the tea in these past years? What comes to mind?
So many. I say that, it's kind of a rabbit hole of reflection. So it's like never ending. And it's a lifetime. Actually, it just continues to meet you in every step of the way, in every moment and present moment in time and space. And it's always relevant, which is just so fascinating. But one of the ways that I would say that it really has a big thing that it has taught me, I mean, there's many things, but to put my finger on one to share is the the opportunity to stop participating in the grasping experience, the experience of grasping for things, of having such a specific agenda all the time with what we want to get out, what we want to get out of something. And if there's one thing that I can say if there's one place in my life that I can really say that I've had to, I've kind of just naturally practiced that non-grasping because it's just what it's inspired in me. But then even the moments where I have tried to grasp, it immediately teaches me that it's just not the way, that I have to sit back and be still and kind of open up my palms and allow the stream of the river to naturally travel across my palms and just receive what's there. So I think that's a really valuable thing to engage in at this day and age, because we do live in a culture where we're always constantly trying to, get something out of what we're doing or accomplish something, or, there's always this like need or agenda for something to be a certain way and the way that we want it to be. And so letting go of that and really allowing things to unfold and being present to that unfolding and stepping into a meeting place with that unfolding, and a symbiotic dance that I'm here to be a conduit to heat the water and brew the tea, but also like I can't heat the water faster than water is going to heat. Like the most frustrating thing is to like be looking at a kettle of water and wanting it to go faster than it's going to go. There's like you can't force it to go any faster than it's going to go at the maximum expression that it's at. So that patience of just sitting back and allowing the elemental world to unfold in and around us, and really understanding like what our role is in the center of that space. Mm-hmm. And so that non-grasping, and also just real practically like an understanding of working with the elements in a very like tangible kind of way. Water, fire, wood, space, metal, earth, and really getting intimate with the processes that they all go through and how they nourish one another and discipline one another, and where I stand in the center of all of that meeting place. So these are, exploring that for lifetimes.
It's a deep connection with the earth, like the tea leaves. And then I remember sitting in ceremony with you and you speaking to that and just reflecting on how all the elements come together to create that experience, and how also the tea really aided in the meditation that we sat in together, and being able to be in that patience. I also wanted to ask you about Vipassana meditation in Goenka. I've sat 2 10 days in my life, and these meditation retreats that have some beginning roots with how the Buddha attained enlightenment. And I know that the tea and the meditation and Buddhism, and they kind of weave together. I'm curious about just your experience with those longer silent meditation retreats, or anything on that topic.
Yeah. So, Vipassana meditation is actually my teacher's like foundational meditation practice, and so he spent time living in the ashrams and in Goenka's ashram in India for quite some time before he moved into his Zen lineage, and with his teacher Tashi Sensei. So, when we sit for long periods of time and we start to, Vipassana is really amazing because, it's like, you don't bring your books, you don't bring anything that's an outlet for the senses, for the sensory experience. You kind of leave it behind. And if you really just commit to the process that is being put before you, and just do the work as it is, as it's presented, it does get to this point, which I can only imagine. I've only sat 10-day courses, and right when it gets to 10 days, I feel like, man, this is just where it's getting juicy. Like I could just keep going, right, and break through more layers and levels, and it's like that. All of a sudden, like it starts to distill this real subtle body experience where all the gross stuff starts to slough off, and I started to have a real understanding of movement that's happening inside of my body, like my cellular experience, and really the efficiency of clarifying the mind. I feel like I was just actually talking about this morning, that when I coming out of that space, that's when I feel I'm more efficient in my mental capacity than any other time, because it's like the bridge between thinking something and doing it and not having all this time in between to go, well, I don't know, and this and that, and it's like all this energy that we leak and waste in the interim of like putting something we think into action. It leaks a lot of chi, and it wastes a lot of time, and it's kind of just what ends up happening. And being forgiving of that experience as well is part of it, and just being equanimous with that, but really experiencing that efficiency where there isn't a bunch of time in between the thought process around, well, I don't know, like should I write it this way or that way, or there's all this kind of ways in which we waste a lot of energy. Actually, like we leak so much energy with all of this kind of back and forth stuff that happens in the mind. So distilling down to a real subtle place and understanding the senses on a subtle level, and then starting to experience the efficiency of mine within that realm it's just an extremely valuable experience. It actually shows me the capability of what I'm able to achieve when I'm really like dedicating myself to just like daily practice and sitting with just like the breath and meditation and understanding that actually it takes time to do that, but it also creates more efficiency of experience in a sense. That makes sense. So
yeah, I love that.
And then when you're stepping into like relating that to tea, the part of our practice in the tradition that I study with Buddha is emptying oneself. So we can just brew tea, right? So I could just pick up the kettle and pour water into the pot and pour the tea into the bowls. But just doing that without having a bunch of other thoughts, like in between those things, is actually extremely challenging, right? If you can just boil the water, just lay the coals, just boil the water, just steep the tea, just pour the tea, just drink the tea, like then you're just experiencing present moment, time and space. And so to do that, we have to empty the self, the container of all of the thoughts and conditionings and patterns and perceptions and ideas, and just be present. And that takes practice to do, because we don't live in a world that is conducive to that kind of emptying. We're always being told more, fill, do. The sensory experience is just completely overloaded. So we don't even know what we're supposed to be feeling, seeing, touching, tasting, thinking anymore. A lot of it is imposed on us by media or conditioning or the environment we grew up around, right?
Yeah.
So we have to distill the self and know who we are without all of that. And that's what, sitting in those kind of quiet spaces can help with. Mm-hmm. Showing you the madness of mind. The madness of the mind.
We know. And we're constantly.
It's mad. Come on, it's so mad.
Yeah, it's true.
No, it's crazy. And actually, like, to see it in that kind of way, like, I have so much compassion for myself and others, because I'm like, oh my God, we're all just so mad. We're completely, our our poor, we're just running with these monkeys that live in our heads that are just like unruly and wild and completely insane and crazy. And when you're just sitting with understanding that the mind is like, if we allow the mind to control us and we don't actually use the other brains, which are the heart and the gut, to dictate a lot of our experience, when we can start to get in touch with our heart brain and our gut brain, and use it to actually just to allow the cerebral mind to do more efficient work, right? That's like in a much more efficient way. We're using the intelligence of the heart and the electromagnetic field of the heart, and we're using the gut and the biome of the gut, in a sense. Those are our spaces of intuition, to actually inform the mind. That's when things get interesting. Mm-hmm. They start to shift, and our experience of life starts to completely change, right? Mm-hmm. And it's beautiful to start to feel that.
Yeah, I have a teacher who says the mind was always meant to be of service to the heart. And it's like our heart is all connected to these deeper realms and source and spirit, and we're our intuition and our guidance. And it's like the mind and the ego, it's like, oh, that's here to bring things into form and to make things happen. And yet it's not supposed to rule the show, which is a lot of what our culture has been in for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to also...
Grandmother Agnes, Grandmother Agnes, Grandmother Agnes, she's one of the oldest 13 indigenous grandmothers. She says, get that thinking thing straight. That thinking thing up there, get it straight. And then she says, the longest journey you'll ever make is the 18-inch journey from your head to your heart. Which I've heard told in different ways, but I always think about it, because it's a long journey, and it can be quite arduous getting that heart mind to be the one who's feels safe and empowered to be in control. Mm-hmm. And not even control. Control is completely the wrong word, but sometimes the English language lacks.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And another question I had for you, because I know a lot of your work is in relationship with other women, and the Spirit Weavers Gathering is an all-women gathering. I'm curious what your journey has been with other women, and if there's been comparison or jealousy or any of those things that sometimes come up in sisterhood type circles or in close friendships, and just how you've navigated that.
I at one point I had this expression that I would share a lot in some of my circles, or I would say, oh, who's triggering you in the circle? Go hang out with that person. Like, that's the person who you should really befriend, right? And expose yourself to. Because it helps to start to break down and break through illusions of the stories that we carry within ourselves. And we project them outwards onto others. And actually the truth that someone has to express on the other side is usually never what story you've created in your head, right? And there's one of the concepts of, there's like 5 no-nos in Zen, and one of those no-nos is no internal conversations. And that was a funny one for me, but to sit with, I was like, what do you mean no internal conversations? But like, what about, okay, you have to sit, reflect, contemplate these things. But what I come to realize too is that it's the minute that we start creating stories about something that's outside of ourselves, and especially if it's based in this idea that we have about someone else, I would say almost always you're creating a whole like fantasy realm of expression that's, I would say, almost vast majority of the time completely untrue. and you've projected all of your wounds and insecurities and traumas and experiences into that story that you're building in your mind. And then all of a sudden you're putting that story on the person in front of you. And then you use that to disassociate and like take your stance surrounding like why you don't want to like, talk to or be friends with, or why you feel justified in your opinion or judgment about someone else. And all of that is just like more separation, right? So if we feel triggered by something and we have the courage to say, oh, hey, like, you really intimidate me, right? I intimidate a lot of people. I'll just kind of put it out there. And that has been at times like a common reflection that has come up, is, oh, that Baelyn, she's kind of strict and scary, or she's mean, or I don't know, and in actuality, I'm strict and I can be intimidating, but it's only because like I have this direction and purpose and focus within my being that sometimes is just so like laser pointed that it can tend to, I'm not so like frilly and foofy and kind of overly like nurturing. That's just, it's not kind of my way, or it's not the way that feels most authentic to me. But I will always like express the truth and be direct. And if you take a moment to stop me and say, hey, I'm having this experience and I take responsibility for my experience and you intimidate me, I will probably just like hug you and be like, thank you, for taking a moment to be courageous. And it softens me immediately, because I'm like, oh my God, like someone's like in this moment, like just completely willing to be vulnerable, right? And take responsibility for their own things that they've created, to disassociate, or to create, to corroborate the story that they want to play out in time and space. So, I'm like a lioness, very strong and very fierce, but I also always have the pride, our whole circle, our whole gathering. That's usually what I'm focusing on, is maintaining a safe harmony for everyone, like holding the space of safety for everyone and holding that space in a way that makes it feel safe for everyone to really start to unwind. And so if for anyone who's ever been on retreat with me, and we get to spend 4 or 5 days, waking up together, sitting for tea, being in that disciplinary state, and then moving through the day, by the evening, it gets wild and spontaneous, and who knows what's going to happen. I'm always tuning into the group. What does the group need? What is most nourishing for everyone in the expression? And how can we unfold and unwind and unwrap together and like go deeper and deeper into that space? And that takes a lot of just listening to everyone, listening to how everyone harmonizes as a group, listening to everyone individually. And in that space, like there's, a lot of, like if we can be more authentic and vulnerable and honest with our experiences, there's so much more space for healing that place of separation. So yeah. I only really had like one, I didn't have a lot of women friends when I was younger, because I grew up in a predominantly masculine environment. And I would have like one girl best friend. And then as I started to soften into my femininity, and when tea came into my life, it's just like I'm surrounded by beautiful women all the time. Just amazing, amazing women who are just so courageous, so brave. Everybody wants to look there's a deep desire to look and to be more authentic and understand the truer expression of the self. And, that's my intention as well. So, that's the space that I hold when I'm in community and in my internal communities with the women that I work with, and sort of in my mentorships and my apprenticeships. And
Yeah, thank you for all of that. Yeah, I read in a book about the ego will always go to creating the separation. And if you notice yourself creating those stories or distancing yourself from something or someone, it's probably the ego, and something that we can look at and just say, okay, is this real? Do I want to go in that direction, or do I want to create connection, intimacy? Truth telling it's a big practice, being vulnerable like that.
Mm-hmm.
A question I like to ask many of my guests on this podcast is, when you think back to the past year or so, what has been a fear that you faced? What fears have you faced? How did you do it?
I guess for me, I'm at this point, this fear is such a kind of arbitrary concept to me at this point in time. And it's usually not something that is expressed so psychologically, but it's something that maybe has been still stored in my body as a trigger or a wound. And I think that it can be really scary to surrender oneself to the pathway and the dharma of being a part of the whole, really. I mean, there's no kind of other way to express it, because we're kind of constantly taught that success has to look a certain way. We have to have a certain amount of resources in and around us for us to feel like we're doing enough or being successful enough. And even the question of, am I doing enough? Am I using the gifts that I've been given to the best of my capacity? And I'm orienting now towards the space of service, and really surrendering to that space of dharma and pathway and service, and continuously trusting that in that alignment, in that authentic alignment of integrity, that I will continue to flourish and be taken care of in a sense. And there's another sort of pathway of the modern day expression of dedicating oneself to a spiritual practice and a path of service towards spirit and source and God and consciousness, and also being able to live in the world and be in partnership, and not losing my practice and self by sacrificing for another, in a sense. And how to do both things. Is it possible to do both things? To be in practice and service, to be in householding and partnership and family, these kinds of ways. It's not so much like this one single pointed fear. It's just how all of those spaces merge and meet. And there are moments, and they come and go very quickly at this point, where maybe there's a big growth and expansion of the heart or in my body. And that is scary, because it's it's a stretching experience, that all of a sudden I'm I'm moving to another edge, and oh my God, it's scary to be at yet another edge. And how do I remain open to this unconditionality of love and freedom and abundance, and not close and limit myself because it's scary to think that, oh, this opening is happening, and on the other side it could be like very quickly taken away, right? And just the trusting that to stay open, constantly is in itself, like, with, trusting to stay open with also like your appropriate healthy boundaries, right? Like this expression of how all those things meet. That's kind of the work that I personally am journeying through, like how all the worlds merge together to create a wholeness of this human expression that I'm living in. And fear is very fleeting. It can very quickly kind of go, oh, fear is an illusion. It's created by the mind.
Yes. Another one of those mad moments.
This might be uncomfortable. Yeah. And this might be uncomfortable, right? And a lot of the times when something is uncomfortable, it brings fear, because we're like, oh, I can't relate to this. It's uncomfortable. This is scary. Right. But the more that we can just make friends with discomfort, then we can actually just go, oh, this is uncomfortable. And just sit with that discomfort.
Yeah.
Right. That's what Vipassana meditation also helps us with. And sitting with oneself is just like, sometimes there's just pain. Yeah. And it just hurts. But fear is in the mind. Right. Mm-hmm. And especially these days, we're not getting chased down by a bear, right? It's like, if you're getting chased by a bear, yeah, okay, afraid. But when you have full authority of your energy and chi and mind and power, actually, you'll turn around and like be one with that expression or experience, and in nature. And so then you could also like completely demolish fear in that, on that occasion as well, right? It's still just, it's all in the mind, and how the mind translates information to the nervous system and the body.
Yeah. Yeah. I find so often fear is, it's either asking us to pay attention, or it's like something unfamiliar is happening, or maybe it's like, if we can get out of the thinking about the future place and just be in the action, it's like there's less room for it to take over. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear just what are you excited about in your business right now, or in your sharing, in your Dharma? Is there any offerings that are coming up that people could hear about, how they can stay in touch with you or potentially do a retreat with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have, I kind of already mentioned this, I believe, but we do our warrior priestess trainings that at the moment is really such, I love this work so much. And I love my teacher and partner and peer, Bree Fisher, who I hold these immersions with. We do them 5 times a year based on the elemental wheel. And it's such specific work, and it's such beautiful work. And those are, they're women's warrior priestess immersion. So some of my most favorite work that I'm doing at the moment. Also, I'm always, wherever I go, I'm always serving tea or giving workshops. I also have a retreat in New Zealand coming up in February that I'll be doing with this really beautiful plant and medicine sister, Flor. And it's called Earth Medicine of the Aotearoa. So we go deep into the magic of that land, which I just love so much. It's such a raw, visceral, wild land. And so that's a really lovely place to kind of dive deep and go into a very immersive we wake up, we have that disciplinary act of drinking tea together. And then as we move through the day, we go deeper and deeper into the plants and magic and being outside and in nature. And Flora guides us through medicine making, and we sing a lot. And so that's a really fun, juicy space. I'm also, in this place where I've been opening up to, in specifically offering one-on-one guidance and mentorship sessions. And I only have a few spots for those in the next coming months that have opened up. And, I've been really quiet about that work, and it's just naturally kind of found me in different ways. Women have found me in different ways to work in that way. And I've kind of liked it that way because I really want to work with people who are really dedicated towards showing up and really wanting to do the work for themselves in their pathway. And so it's not like one-off things. It's like, 3 to 6 to 9 month commitments where we get to go deep into the patterning of our conditioned experience. And, especially if it's regarding tea, someone wants to learn more about how to be of service to tea. Well, to brew a nice cup of tea, you have to purify the self and then brew tea naturally. That's like a very easy way to put it, is empty the self and become as authentic as you can be in your expression and embodiment, and then just brew tea naturally, right? So to do that, we have to dive into a lot of ways in which we've restricted ourselves from the truth of who we are. And so we have to become more intimate with ourselves. And that's a nice, being in one-on-one accountable relationship is a really a deep way to work. So I'm also available for that in certain cases.
Beautiful. I'm glad you're doing that work. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you have any closing words for the people listening? Any last thoughts, closing words before I bring this to a close with a short prayer?
As my teacher says a lot at the end of his workshops, for anyone who's listening, anything that I've, shared and deeply resonated and rang a string or a bell within your being that was already inside of you and your wisdom to begin with. And we're just here remembering together. And anything that that didn't resonate, or you can just put that through the digestive system and let it go, and just take the seeds that nourish you and plant them and allow them to water them and grow them into a sweet garden within the internal self. And so, just sending prayers and, love and compassion to all beings out there that are doing the work and dedicating themselves to path and toward consciousness, and also sending a lot of love and light and compassion to those that find themselves in a place of darkness or suffering or sadness or grief or pain. We're all sort of in this together, and just wishing happiness and liberation and peace to all beings. Thank you so much for having me, Meredith.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just bring my hands to my heart and just add on that to close, just breathing in and feeling into our body and remembering our gratitude. And every time I have these conversations, it's just like, oh, exactly what I need to hear. So thank you so much, Baelyn. And I know there's a lot of gratitude from the people listening to this as well. So bringing that in and holding it in our hearts. And we vow. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.
Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to our show today. We would love to hear what you think. Take a moment to hop on over to iTunes and leave us a review. We'd be so grateful to receive it. Until next time, namaste.